The knock came at 11:30 at night. I was already in my work gear, boots on, keys in hand, about to leave for the depot because the ice storm had knocked out the grid 40 minutes earlier and my phone had been ringing non-stop since. I opened the door and it was Nadine Fletcher, my HOA president, standing on my porch in a fur-lined coat with her phone flashlight pointed at my face. She said she needed my propane patio heater because her power was out and her home heating system had failed and she was cold. She said it in the tone she used for everything, the tone of a person who had decided that asking and demanding were the same thing. I looked at her. Then I looked at the truck idling in my driveway, the one with the Regional Emergency Fuel Coordinator decal on the door. I said, "Nadine, I cannot help you right now. I have 43 distribution points to service and 12 hospitals on my priority list, and your HOA fine for my propane storage is still unpaid." Then I got in the truck and I drove into the worst ice storm this county had seen in 31 years. What happened over the next 18 hours is why Nadine Fletcher no longer lives in that neighborhood, why the HOA board issued a formal resolution protecting residential propane storage rights that is still on the books, and why every time the temperature drops below 20 degrees in Sycamore Ridge, somebody remembers the night their HOA president had to sleep in her car because she had spent 4 months trying to take away the one thing that could have kept her warm. Stay with me. My name is Dale Whitfield, and I have lived at 88 Sycamore Ridge Drive for 9 years. My professional background is in fuel logistics, specifically propane and heating oil distribution, which I spent 22 years doing at the operational level before moving into the emergency coordination role I now hold. My current position is Regional Emergency Fuel Coordinator for the Tri-County area, which is a title that sounds bureaucratic and is in fact one of the most practically consequential jobs in the region during a winter emergency. When the grid goes down in a cold event, and the hospitals need backup fuel, and the emergency shelters need heating, and the fire stations need to keep their apparatus bays above freezing, the calls come to me. I manage the priority list, I coordinate the distribution routes, I authorize emergency draws from the reserve depots, and I make the decisions about who gets fuel first when there is not enough to go around all at once. I have held this role for 6 years. I take it seriously. It has never been more serious than the night Nadine Fletcher knocked on my door. The backstory begins 4 months before the ice storm, in the ordinary aggravation of a dispute that I had expected to be minor and that Nadine had decided to make significant. The dispute was about my propane storage. My property at 88 Sycamore Ridge Drive had several propane installations. The first was the standard residential tank that supplied my whole house generator, a setup similar to many homes in the development, a 250-gallon above-ground tank in the rear yard powering a standby generator that I had installed 7 years ago. The second was a larger 500-gallon tank in the side yard that I used for what I described to the HOA accurately as professional equipment testing and maintenance purposes. In my work as a fuel coordinator, I was responsible for maintaining familiarity with a wide range of propane-powered heating equipment, from residential units to commercial and industrial heaters, and I kept several units on my property in various states of assessment. The 500-gallon tank gave me the capacity to run extended tests on equipment under realistic load conditions without disrupting my household supply. The third installation was a pair of large commercial-grade patio heaters on my rear deck that I used during our outdoor family gatherings and that also served, when needed, as demonstrators when I was training new field technicians on heater operation. None of these installations were secrets. They were all permitted. The tanks had been installed by licensed contractors with county building permits on file. The equipment had been inspected. I had documented all of it in the HOA's pre-approval process when I installed the 500-gallon tank 3 years ago, and the committee had approved it with the condition that I maintain the standard screening requirement, which I had done with a cedar fence section that enclosed the tank on 3 sides. Nadine had become HOA president 8 months before the dispute began, inheriting a board and a governance structure that had been running reasonably under the previous president, and applying to it the specific intensity of a person who had strong views about what a premium residential community should look like and was not interested in gradual implementation. In her first 6 months, she had revised the landscape standards, created a vehicle parking matrix, and initiated a property audit in which every visible exterior feature of every home in the development was assessed for guideline compliance. The audit was the instrument through which she found me. The audit report, which arrived as a formal notice in early October, cited 3 items on my property. The first was that the 500-gallon tank screening fence was 1 inch shorter than the minimum screening height specified in the guidelines, a discrepancy I measured myself and confirmed was accurate. I adjusted the fence cap that same week and submitted photographic documentation. The second was that one of the commercial patio heaters was visible from the common area path when positioned at a specific angle, which the auditor had noted as an aesthetic concern. The third was that the total propane storage capacity on my property between the 2 tanks exceeded what the audit report described as the community standard for residential propane storage. I want to explain the third item because it is the one that drove everything that followed and because understanding it requires some context. The HOA's guidelines had a provision regarding propane storage that limited residential tanks to a single above-ground tank of no more than 250 gallons for any property not engaged in commercial activity. The provision had been written years ago with the standard residential setup in mind. My 500-gallon tank, which I had installed with full disclosure and board approval 3 years prior, had been approved under a professional use exception that was written into the approval letter. Nadine's audit had not reviewed the approval history for individual items. It had compared current conditions against the current guidelines and flagged any apparent discrepancy. I wrote back within a week, attaching the original approval letter for the 500-gallon tank and the permit documentation, and explaining that my installation was operating under an explicitly granted exception that was documented in the HOA's own records. I assumed this would close the matter. It did not. Nadine's response was that the previous board's approval had been granted without adequate consideration of the community's standards, and that the current board had the authority to review and revoke previously granted exceptions if they determined that the original approval was inconsistent with the community's interests. She said she was initiating a board review of my propane storage installations, and that in the interim I should consider the exception as under evaluation. I called my attorney, a woman named Patricia Aldridge who had handled property matters for me before, and I read her Nadine's letter. Patricia said that the board's authority to revoke a previously granted, validly issued exception was legally questionable, and that if the board proceeded in that direction, she had some things to say about it. She said to document everything and let the review process run before filing anything, because sometimes these things resolved themselves. The review process did not resolve itself. The board held 3 sessions over 6 weeks, at which I was invited to present my case twice, and at which I presented the approval letter, the permit documentation, a summary of the professional purpose the installation served, and a letter from my employer, the County Emergency Management Office, describing my role and the operational necessity of maintaining familiarity with heating equipment at my home. The board listened. Nadine had prepared a counter-presentation at each session, focused on the visual impact of the larger tank, the precedent that allowing it set for other residents who might want to install oversized storage, and the guidelines' plain language about residential storage limits. The board voted 3-2 to revoke my exception and require the removal of the 500-gallon tank within 60 days, to retain the 250-gallon generator tank, which was within the standard limit, and to require that the commercial patio heaters be stored out of sight when not in active use. I received the formal removal notice the first week of November. Patricia filed a legal challenge within 5 days, which automatically extended the removal deadline while the challenge was pending. The challenge argued that the board lacked authority to revoke a validly issued exception without demonstrating a material change in circumstances, that my approval letter constituted a binding agreement between myself and the HOA, and that the removal of equipment I used in my professional capacity as a county emergency coordinator created operational impacts that extended beyond a private residential dispute. Patricia had included a letter from the County Emergency Management Director, my supervisor, describing my role and noting that the equipment I maintained at my residence was part of the county's emergency preparedness posture. The legal challenge was pending when the ice storm arrived. The storm had been in the forecast for 10 days. I had watched it develop with the professional attention of someone whose job becomes exponentially more complicated when winter weather hits. The models were consistently showing a significant freezing rain and sleet event, the kind that glazes every surface and breaks tree limbs onto power lines and takes down the grid in wide sections. I had been in contact with my depot managers for a week, verifying inventory levels, pre-positioning reserve supplies at strategic distribution points, confirming that the priority list was current and that the hospital and emergency shelter contacts had been notified of potential service demands. I had briefed the County Emergency Management Director on the preparedness status, and she had told me we were as ready as we could be. What I had not briefed was my HOA president, because my HOA president was not on any list that required briefing, and because the two matters, the professional emergency preparation and the residential dispute, occupied completely separate compartments in my professional thinking. They were about to collide. The grid failed at 11:14 p.m. on a Thursday in late January. The storm had been intensifying for 6 hours, and the ice loading had reached the point where the transmission infrastructure could not hold. My phone started ringing at 11:16. The first call was from my overnight depot manager, the second from the county emergency shelter coordinator, the third from the facilities manager at St. Catherine's Hospital, which was our largest regional medical facility and which was running on backup power and needed a priority fuel delivery to its standby systems within the hour. I was dressed and had my gear on before the fourth call finished. I went to the kitchen to get my thermos and my root binder, and that is when I heard the knock at the front door. I have described what happened next in the hook, and I want to add the detail of it here, the specific texture of that moment, because it mattered. Nadine was standing on my porch, and she was cold, and she was frightened, and I understood both of those things. She was not a sympathetic figure to me at that point in our relationship, but she was a person standing in the dark in an ice storm, and I do not confuse my professional obligation with my personal feelings when they point in different directions. I told her I could not help her, and I told her why, and I told her the HOA fine for my propane storage was still unpaid, which was true. I had not paid it because Patricia had advised me not to during the legal challenge, and then I got in my truck. I want to be precise about one thing. I could not give Nadine my propane heater in any practical sense because I needed it. The commercial patio heaters I kept were not decorative. They were working equipment that I had used on multiple occasions to supplement heating at emergency sites, specifically at outdoor staging areas and temporary command posts where commercial heating equipment was needed quickly. I had loaded both units into my work truck at 6 p.m. that evening when I was staging for the storm response. They were in the truck when Nadine knocked, even if I had wanted to leave one with her, which the circumstances of our relationship did not make me inclined to do. Removing equipment from my emergency staging was not something I was in a position to authorize on my own judgment at 11:30 p.m. when St. Catherine's Hospital was waiting on a priority fuel delivery. The 18 hours that followed were among the most demanding of my professional career. The storm was worse than the models had predicted in its duration, if not its intensity. The grid was down across a wide area and restoration was slow because the ice kept reloading the repaired lines. I ran my priority route twice, managing the depot inventory against the demand, making real-time decisions about which secondary recipients had to wait and which could not. My team performed well. The hospitals stayed fueled. The emergency shelters ran through the night without interruption. 3 nursing facilities that were on my secondary priority list got their deliveries by 4 a.m., which was faster than I had expected. By 6 in the morning, the immediate critical infrastructure was stable, and I was working on the residential priority tier. Nadine, I learned later from several different sources who had been in contact with her during the night, had attempted 4 different approaches to heating before the night was over. She had first gone to her next-door neighbor Mark Duval and asked to use his fireplace, which he had, and he had accommodated her for a period, but they had a complicated history from a noise dispute the previous summer, and the arrangement had ended before midnight. She had then attempted to drive to her sister's house across town and discovered that the roads were impassable. She had called a hotel and been told there were no rooms because the hotel was prioritizing displaced persons from a section of the county where the grid failure had coincided with burst water pipes and the rooms were occupied. She had ultimately spent a portion of the night in her car with the engine running for heat, which is a situation that I do not take satisfaction in describing, but which I am also not going to pretend did not happen. The grid was partially restored in our neighborhood at approximately 6:30 the following morning. Full restoration came in phases over the following 24 hours. Nadine's heating system, which had failed during the outage, was repaired by a technician the day after the storm. I was back at my desk by noon the day after the storm, writing the incident report that every major emergency response required and reviewing the distribution data with my team. The response had gone as well as could be expected. The critical infrastructure had been maintained. There were no serious cold-related medical emergencies in the county's priority facilities. The residential tier had taken longer than I would have wanted, but the winter storm protocol allowed for it, and the outcomes were within acceptable parameters. The legal challenge to the HOA's removal order was still pending. Patricia had been following the storm and its relationship to my situation with professional attention. She called me the day after the grid was restored and said she thought the timing had created some additional context that might be relevant to how the board wished to proceed with the challenge. She said she would prepare a supplemental filing that documented my role in the emergency response and the relationship between my professional equipment and the county's emergency posture, and that she thought the board's counsel should have the opportunity to review this before the challenge was decided. The supplemental filing went in the following week. Patricia had obtained a letter from the county emergency management director that described, in precise terms, my role in the storm response, the equipment I had deployed from my residential property, and the director's professional assessment that the removal of the 500-gallon tank and the associated equipment from my property would reduce the county's emergency response capability in a measurable way. The letter was on official county letterhead, and it was specific, and it was not the kind of document that a homeowners association board found easy to dismiss. The board meeting to address the legal challenge was held 3 weeks after the storm. I attended with Patricia. Nadine was present, but was notably quieter than she had been at the previous 3 sessions. The board's counsel, a man named Warren who had been appearing increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the matter over the previous several weeks, presented the HOA's position with the subdued energy of a lawyer who does not fully believe what he is arguing. Patricia presented our response with the confidence of one who does. The board voted 3-2 to dismiss the removal order and to reinstate my professional use exception in its original form. The 2 votes against were Nadine and a board member named Craig who had been consistently aligned with her. The 3 votes in favor were the remaining board members, 2 of whom, I later learned, had been without heat for significant portions of the night of the storm and who had thought about that experience carefully before casting their votes. The formal resolution that the board passed alongside the dismissal was Nadine's last significant act as president before she resigned 3 weeks later, and I want to describe it because it was not something I had requested or anticipated. The resolution established a policy protecting residential propane storage installations that had been permitted by the county and approved by the HOA under professional or emergency preparedness exemptions from future revocation without documented evidence of safety violations or material changed circumstances. Patricia told me the resolution was unusual, and that it reflected the board's understanding that they had created a situation that needed a structural remedy rather than just a case-by-case resolution. The resolution is still on the books. Andrew Harvorson, who became president after Nadine's resignation and who I have found consistently reasonable in the years since, told me once that it is cited occasionally when new board members raise questions about storage exceptions and that it has settled several potential disputes before they developed. I told him that was the right use for it. My 500-gallon tank is still in the side yard, screened by the cedar fence section, and has been serviced annually without incident. The commercial patio heaters spend most of the year in my equipment storage area and come out for family gatherings and for professional use as needed. They were deployed twice in the 3 years following the storm, both times to support outdoor heating at county emergency staging areas, both times performing exactly as the equipment was designed to perform. Nadine sold her house 10 months after her resignation. I did not see her move out. I was out of town for a work conference on that weekend, and I came home to a sold sign in the yard and a new family moving boxes in a week later. The new neighbors are a young couple named the Oylarans with twin daughters who are 4 years old and who have appointed themselves informal investigators of everything that happens on the block. They knocked on my door last November to ask about the big tank in my yard. I told them it was propane, which is what natural gas is made from sort of, and that it powered a machine that made electricity when the regular electricity went off. The older twin by 4 minutes asked if it was like a battery. I told her it was exactly like a battery, just a very big one that used gas instead of chemicals. She thought about this and said that was cool. I told her I thought so too. Some knowledge matters when it matters and is invisible the rest of the time. That is the nature of emergency preparedness. You build the capacity and you maintain it, and you hope the situation never arises where it is tested, and when the situation does arise, you are ready, and the thing you built does what it was built to do. The 500-gallon tank in my side yard is part of that capacity. It was there before Nadine arrived. It was there during everything she did to remove it. It is there now. It will be there the next time the ice comes. Thumbnail text ===. She demanded my heater in an ice storm. I was already fueling the county's hospitals.